Thanks so much for joining the Santa Fe Watershed Association as we explore the important relationships between soil and water within the context of the Santa Fe River watershed.
My name is Aaron Kaufman.
I'm Maury Hensley. Today we are at the top of the Arroyo de los Pinos with Aaron to learn about the negative impacts water can have on soil due to fluvial erosion and how to instead harness the power of water to promote soil health. The perpetual soil water mantra is, slow it, spread it, sink it. Unfortunately, there are many areas in the Santa Fe River watershed where soil has been disturbed through mismanagement. This presentation will focus on methods that property owners and land managers can use to mitigate erosion and improve soil hydrology in urban and rural settings. Whether your local soil lies within the boundaries of the Santa Fe River watershed or a different watershed, we hope that some of the concepts and histories we'll be discussing throughout the series will provide you with useful information and inspiration for your own explorations of soil and watershed stewardship.
The intention behind today's videos is to focus on sites that are most vulnerable to erosion and how to mitigate it. And so we would encourage you to look around your own property and see if there are certain variables that might be contributing to soil loss. A few factors to pay attention to are denuded vegetation, so areas that have maybe either been burned or grazed, maybe scraped for the purposes of agricultural plantings. Essentially, if you lose that vegetative cover, the soil is more bare and prone to runoff. The second factor might be compacted soils. So you can see this dirt road here in front of me, or the trails behind me, or if you actually compact the soil to the point where you're trying to create like a cap or a parking lot, essentially you're preventing water from infiltrating the soil surface, so that would lead to erosion due to excess runoff. And then the third factor would be areas that are steeper or have a higher gradient. So essentially the water, as it's moving down those slopes, has more momentum and energy to actually lift and displace soil particles as it's moving down that gradient. This is a good example of sheet erosion. Basically, you have water moving across the land surface kind of uniformly. There is no distinct channel. And so because it's moving kind of more spread out across the surface, it's not capable of lifting or carrying as much soil or material away. So the nice thing about sheet erosion is we're not losing large volumes of soil all at once. And because the water is spread out more evenly across the surface, it's sinking into the ground, kind of recharging soil moisture in those areas. So here's a good example of some pine needles that have kind of created these bands here. Basically the water's moving through here. It barely can lift or move these pine needles before it drops back down to the ground. So this is kind of the ideal form of water erosion if it's going to occur on the land surface. This is an example of rill erosion. Basically you have the concentration of water across the land surface into a small channel, and then that erosive force of the water begins to kind of cut or form an incised channel. The concern with rills is they lead to rapid loss of soil. You tend to see them a lot next to road cuts on highways, on recently plowed farms or agricultural fields. And in this case, this is probably a consequence of historic overgrazing and a nearby parking lot. One of the negative consequences of rill erosion is that plants that are adjacent to those channels tend to have more exposed roots. So here you have some snakeweed with some roots being exposed, some blue grama, and essentially those plants begin to dry out. So even though these are drought-tolerant plant species, they effectively are living in drier conditions because of this rill formation, and ultimately they're likely to die from those conditions, and then you lose the soil conservation being provided by that vegetation cover. Rills are considered to be the contributor to the most soil loss of kind of different types of water-driven soil erosion. This is an example of a gully or an arroyo. The idea being that you had the confluence of multiple rills coming together and the erosive force of those smaller channels became more concentrated, and you form kind of a larger, deeper erosive channel. This one is particularly extreme. You can see that it's probably close to 10 feet tall. You can see the exposure of roots from drought-tolerant trees like juniper and pinon. So essentially, over time, the exposure of these roots is going to dry or these trees out, make them more vulnerable to beetle kill and things like that, and ultimately probably cave in. Over time, there will be some sort of equilibrium found here once the channel reaches a point where the water can spread more evenly across the bottom, and it should recolonize with grasses and forbs and things like that. But it can be a long process, and certainly the process of recovery is usually much longer than the process of erosion. So aggradation accrues much slower than soil loss. This is an example of a head cut, and the concern here is that you have a rapid transition in grade, so that when water is pouring over the edge here, essentially it's scouring at the base, continues to allow soil to kind of calve into that, and then this little miniature waterfall progressively moves up slope. So essentially that chewing away of soil is moving up in elevation, and so the head cut is kind of continuously active. You can kind of think of it as a waterfall. In order to address this, sometimes you can apply or use a Zuni bowl. They're a little more complicated to build, or you could certainly kind of start to level this down into an appropriate slope, create a concave shape, line it with stone, and turn it into a rock rundown, which is a great method of addressing head cut formations or steeper slopes with erosion now. There are examples in which an arroyo essentially can have a head cut at its uppermost slope, and it's certainly a process in which an arroyo can start to expand or continue to erode. So you may come across sections of arroyos where you see its origin, where water is coming off of kind of what maybe historically was an old swale or more uniform runoff across the land surface, and essentially hit that little nick point. The water pours into it more rapidly, and it starts to cut away, and it starts to form that larger channel. So absolutely, you expect to find in a lot of cases the origins of arroyos or small rills, channels, and things like that. There's a good chance you'd find a head cut similar to this. So this is a great example of a site that has minimal erosion driven by water. We have kind of a couple of conditions here that meet some of our healthy soil principles, including good ground cover. So we have good grass mat through here, covering most of the soil, very little bare soil, and we're maintaining a living root, because we can tell that these grasses are still in pretty good shape. They're a little dry at the moment just because of some current drought conditions, but for the most part they're still alive and will respond to some precipitation. Another good indication that soils are stable here and less disturbed than other sites is we have some small cryptogrammic crusts. This is a good indication that these soils are less disturbed than other areas. They're really fragile. These are oftentimes the first kind of organic systems that are degraded in conditions that are compacted from trails or walked on or overgrazed and things like that. So this is a good example of a site that's going to have very minimal soil movement, because when water falls on this site, these plants and these root systems are making the soil more porous, improving infiltration, and then slowing water down, forcing it to meander around each pedestal if there actually is any runoff occurring. So one of the best ways to address erosion that results from excess runoff is to slow, sink, and spread that water. There's a fantastic technical guide that is available both on the Quivira Coalition and Watershed Artisans websites. And it basically focuses on a series of structures that can be built on upland areas as well as in channels. And the idea is that each of these structures are intended to kind of initially slow runoff as it's passing through. So basically, as you're slowing that water down, it loses its erosive energy. You can kind of start to sink that water into the ground, which are basically enhancing soil moisture, which is made available to plant roots, which in turn will enhance soil stability, and to spread that water when you have opportunities. So by distributing it more evenly across the landscape surface, you're enhancing that soil moisture over a greater area, making it more available to vegetation, which is kind of the primary or best way to stabilize soils on a landscape surface. We're standing in the Arroyo de los Pinos up near Museum Hill, and a good example are the benefits of slowing water down through a channel, and allowing it to kind of sink in where opportunities present themselves, is that you're enhancing the soil moisture. And so despite this being an ephemeral channel, basically a channel that only flows when you get a storm event, we're able to maintain vegetation like coyote willow, which you would typically see next to a stream channel that has more intermittent or perennial flow. So the benefits of a structure like this is It's preventing the scour of this channel, which would typically result in more rapid runoff and loss of the water as it's passing through. Instead, that water is kind of sinking into the ground. It's being prolonged a little bit between storms, and it's allowing vegetation that you would typically find in a riparian system to get established. This is an example of a gabion structure. It's a more aggressive method of trying to plug a channel or a gully. So you can see this one's almost 6 feet tall. This one's pretty old. This may have been built by the CCC back in the 30s or 40s. And so incredibly beneficial in terms of storing massive amounts of sediment behind it. The concern with being this aggressive is that at some point some of this wire may start to rust or corrode and break, and at some point you may have kind of a giant sediment plume coming out of here. So there are other methods of addressing erosion in gullies or in small channels that are a little less aggressive, but might have a bit more longevity. This is an example of a rock rundown. The intention behind this type of structure is if you have a really steep slope that has the formation of a rill or has a head cut at the top of it, the idea is that you want to armor that slope so that the water is allowed to pass down that steeper gradient to a point where it can kind of level back out and dissipate some of its energy. And so the idea when you're building a structure like this is initially you start from the bottom, so you can anchor in the largest stones at the bottom and build up from there. And so basically these were put in first, and then subsequently stones were placed in front of it going up the slope after it's kind of been ramped down. It was seeded before any of the rocks were placed, so you can see some of the different types of forbs and grasses moving in to the structure over time, adding additional armoring. And the other thing to kind of pay close attention to is the concave shape of the structure. Basically, it's forcing water to concentrate through the middle of the channel as opposed to trying to circumvent the edges of it, which would be less armored and potentially more prone to erosion. So this is an example of a media luna, and the intention here is at a point where a channel is kind of starting to reach a flatter area. Oftentimes you'd see this at the base of a mountain, kind of the alluvial deposition or alluvial fans. This is intended to mimic that. So we have a small channel here to my left, and essentially as that water is coming out of this channel, it's finding kind of some less steep gradient, and then this structure is intended to kind of accentuate the fan shape so that the water spreads evenly across the bottom as opposed to staying constricted in a small channel. By doing that, you're slowing, spreading, and sinking that water across a greater area, which can improve vegetation cover and store more water in the soil. This is an example of a zuni bowl, and the intention here is that there was probably a rapid change in grade from a head cut at this point in the channel. So essentially, water would have been pouring over the top here, rushing down, and then that head cut would have been migrating upslope or up channel. And so in order to kind of prevent that erosive force from occurring, a zuni bowl was built here. So it was armored at the pour over point. And so as water pours over this edge, there's a secondary set of stones here so that you create kind of a pool here. So as the water pours over the top, it can scour, drops the sediment as it slows down, and then progresses through with a little less erosive energy. So we're standing at a one rock dam. This is one of the most basic structures that can be used in a channel to slow down the erosive process. It's typically built at a straight section of the channel, or what's often referred to as the crossover. So as water comes around a bend, it naturally wants to drop some of the sediments carrying, and this just kind of forces or enhances that depositional process. So we're at a straight section of the channel. These stones have basically been laid across the channel bottom, and they kind of climb up the edges a little bit, so it's a little bit concave in shape, concentrating some of the water in the center of the channel. But essentially they're totally embedded, but with just a slight rise or lift. So there's still soil stored behind the structure a little bit, so you can lift the channel slightly. But most importantly, it armors the bottom of the channel, prevents water from scouring or continuing to incise that channel during erosive or high-intensity storms.
Impervious surfaces, most commonly a side effect of urban development, are one of the greatest disturbances to soil in urban areas. The soil underneath them is cut off from light, moisture, and air, and thus is unable to function ecologically. Meanwhile, The massive volume of water that runs off these surfaces during storm events picks up speed and power as it is forced through storm drains, gutters, and culverts into arroyos and the river, carrying toxic pollutants with it. This runoff not only causes aggressive erosion, but can damage infrastructure and even endanger human lives during flash floods. Furthermore, the runoff from large storm events is essentially wasted from the watershed perspective because it's traveling too fast to recharge groundwater. Instead, it strips the landscape's precious topsoil and contributes to further desertification. In addition to building structures to ameliorate the effects of erosion, one fantastic way to reduce runoff in the first place, even in developed areas such as parking lots and medians, is by building rain gardens or bioretention basins. These areas are designed to divert stormwater runoff into specifically designed areas that can infiltrate groundwater and naturally break down harmful pollutants.
So the way that this particular rain garden functions is that we have kind of an elevated section of asphalt behind me, back here. The water is shedding off of that asphalt. It's running towards this curb and gutter, and essentially typically would flow right past here. But when this rain garden was installed, we have the ability to kind of push the water into this depression. The volume here is probably between 400 and 800 gallons of just standing water. We would have additional water actually moving through the soil profile. So there's quite a bit of soil moisture storage opportunities here. And then by enhancing that soil moisture, we can kind of keep plants alive that in some cases wouldn't exist in this climate, like a sycamore. Typically, you would expect to find this type of tree next to a river or stream, not in a parking lot. We also have some really great native grasses. This is a little blue stem. By enhancing the soil moisture here, this grass can kind of develop longer roots, and along that root surface, there are a number of different types of bacteria which are beneficial because they break down petroleum products. We can also keep native plants alive like three-leaf sumac, as well as indigo bush there in the back. These are beneficial because they provide pollinator habitat or improvement by producing flowers that bees and butterflies and other pollinators can take advantage of. And then in some of the other rain gardens, we actually have a number of species that are intended to provide fruit for birds and other species. So that's kind of the idea here, but it's all made feasible by enhanced soil moisture coming from these impervious surfaces and improving kind of the ability of these plants to take up water through their root systems. Another fascinating thing to kind of note about these two types of grasses is this is the little blue stem, this is saccatone. And historically, these types of grasses would have existed pretty extensively around this landscape. And a lot of them have been lost from overgrazing, but also because of erosive forces. So essentially, as you dry out the soil because water is running off of it more quickly, there's more bare soil because of disturbance, whether it be fire or grazing or in some cases development. Essentially, that soil isn't holding enough moisture to maintain particularly plants like little bluestem and another similar species called big bluestem, which need that enhanced soil moisture in order to kind of thrive in this landscape. They're extremely beneficial because they have extensive root systems below the soil as well, so they're helping hold a lot of soil in place. But the only way that they can exist is by slowing, sinking, and spreading that water across the surface in order to kind of enhance the soil moisture availability for these plants to thrive. One other thing to kind of note here is that we have cobble mulch, and because there'd be a fair amount of current coming through here during high intensity storms, if this was just bare soil, a lot of that soil could potentially wash away. And so basically this area was excavated down. There was some improved compost mixed in with the soils to kind of improve the nutrient value for the species of plants that were going to be planted here, as well as some wood chips and then kind of a little bit of a weed barrier. But on top of that is the cobble mulch, and really that provides two things. One, it reduces the impact of the solar energy hitting the soil surface, so you're reducing the evaporation loss, so you're maintaining more soil moisture below those rocks. And then the other thing is it's actually stabilizing the soils in place. It's preventing those soils from washing away because of the amount of runoff that's coming from this impervious area.
To wrap up, here are some key takeaways from this video. When soil is disturbed through constant erosion, it's impossible to apply the other 4 healthy soil principles. Preventing further soil loss and erosion is the first step to minimizing all other forms of disturbance. Once soil is stabilized, covering it with gravel mulch is a great way to protect soil moisture and prevent further erosion in extremely vulnerable areas. Plants can eventually colonize the area and help cover the soil too, thus also maintaining a living root and maximizing biodiversity above and below the soil surface. Integrating animals such as pollinators and soil organisms will further help plants get established. Now more than ever, as the climate in our watershed is projected to become hotter and drier in the coming decades, it's extremely important to protect our water. Arguably, the best way to do this is by maximizing infiltration and groundwater recharge. In order to do this, we must slow the flow of water across the soil surface, spreading it out as much as possible so that it can sink into deeper soil layers. Aquifers protected by a layer of healthy topsoil lose substantially less water to evaporation and contribute not only to more reliable drinking water for people, but a healthier landscape overall. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the rest of our series. See you around the watershed.